Hello everybody, my name is Rachel and welcome to another weekly reading wrap-up. I finished 5 books this past week and all of them were quite short, like short novels or novellas actually. And I may have a rant about one of these, we'll see. I'm incredibly distracted this morning. I really want to go off and try my first attempt at making pita bread. I have other books I want to finish that are calling my name. I just feel like my head really isn't into filming and talking about things, so we'll see how this goes. First up, I finished Flight of Magpies by K.J. Charles, which is the last book in the Charm of Magpies series. I talked about the first 2 books last week, and this is more of the same. I continued to really like Crane and Stephen as characters. As people, I found them both to be very interesting. I continued to like the fantasy aspect, the magic, the world building, and it was very satisfying to have some of the last questions answered and things tied up and wrapped up in this final book. I just found it a very satisfying conclusion, let's say. The one thing that continued to drag the series down for me is that it's fantasy romance. I like the fantasy. The romance, I'm just not super into. Like, okay, I like Crane and Stephen both, and I can see them together. I just didn't enjoy reading about their sexual dynamic. They're very dominant, submissive in the bedroom. It gets a bit rough, and I felt like it was even more so in this last book, and it's just not my thing in romance, so yeah. I did really enjoy the series though, so I will probably read more by K.J. Charles in the future, just to satisfy my curiosity about some of her other work. And you probably want to know my rant on that one book, so here we go. It was The Embedding by Ian Watson. I was primed and ready to love this book because it has all of my favorite buzzwords in the description. It's a science fiction novel about language and linguistics and alien first contact, and I love those things. But I found this book very disturbing on an ethical level. I felt extremely cold towards all the characters, and I also thought it was just flat out not written super well and not constructed very well as a story. There's some blurb or something on this that calls it hallucinatory. No, it just doesn't make that much sense in some places. So I have to kind of describe the whole premise of the book to get to the bits that I deeply disliked. So there are like 3 parts to this. The first one is with, I think, the main character, Chris Soule, who is a researcher into like embedded languages. He's trying to study, I think, how the structure of one's language affects your perception of the world, of reality, or just how you behave and such. And he is participating in research where they have taken children and are raising them in isolation in constructed worlds. There are 3 of these worlds, and his is the embedded world, where they have 3 children who are isolated and they're only interacted with using a language that is deeply recursive and embedded, and they're seeing if this has an effect on the children as they grow up and learn language. This is my first problem with this. That's incredibly unethical, and it gets worse when you dig into the actual particulars of which children they've chosen for this. So just number 1, I am aware that this book was written in the 1970s and at a time when we didn't have as much ethical oversight into scientific experiments and such. There wasn't as much protection for participants, willing or unwilling, in experiments and research like this. I'm not sure on the dates. It's been a long time since I had this course in grad school, guys. But I am aware this was written at a time when this particular situation wouldn't have raised as many red flags, and so I am clearly looking at it through a 21st century ethical experimentation lens here. But I think it's just really obvious in any time period that taking orphaned war refugee children and experimenting on them is just bad. And this is compounded, I think, by the fact that all the main characters of this story, all the scientists, all the researchers, all the people in charge are white. And most of the children in Chris Soule's experiment are described as being brown, as being Pakistani, and then in the next part we have more race issues. I just find this very disturbing. White scientists have taken orphaned Pakistani children and are experimenting on them in a situation that is mentally and physically endangering them. Children end up hurt and dead by the end of this book. Like, it's not good. This is terrible. The second part of the story is with a French researcher named Pierre who is living with an Amazonian tribe in Brazil. He is interested in their apparently embedded language and a fungus drug that they take during their rituals. He thinks that they actually do perceive time and reality differently because of their language and its structure and this drug that they take. And he wants to find out about all this stuff before their way of life is eradicated by the rising waters from a dam that's been constructed in Brazil. And then the third part of the story is that aliens show up in their ship and they make first contact. They're basically collecting languages. They want to kind of like collect all the languages in the universe and superimpose these different ways of perceiving reality, and that will somehow give them the answers they want or help them find this thing they're looking for. And the reason for that was just so ludicrous. I was just like rolling my eyes at it. It did not, I just, whatever. And then to make it even worse, the aliens say, if you give us like 6 examples of human languages, we will give you knowledge you want to basically become a spacefaring race. And the humans in charge say, oh yeah, we'll totally do that. The catch, the aliens don't just want examples of languages, they want the actual brains of like native speakers of those languages. Yes, the aliens want human brains, and the couple of people in charge on the human side say, we will totally kidnap people and give them to you to have their brains and spinal columns and eyes removed because we want your technology so bad. So they literally do this. They kidnap people off the street. They're also going to take some people from the tribe that Pierre is with. And at this point, it completely loses me, guys. There's so many problems with this. It was just so ethically wrong. I hated the characters for making these sorts of decisions, for seeming so selfish and so, like, they just have tunnel vision. And then it just goes wrong. Like, the entire plan falls through, and there's so much collateral damage. I think like tens of thousands of people end up dead by the end of the book directly because of what some humans are trying to do, and I'm just done. I don't recommend this book. I thought it was kind of bad, and I didn't like the way it made me feel. It just made me feel icky while I was reading it, so no. Next up, I read a short novella called Then Will the Great Ocean Wash Deep Above by Ian Sales. This is the third story in the Apollo Quartet. I've read the other 3 stories out of order. I think you can read them in any order you want to because it's more of a thematic series. Each of the stories is an alternate history retelling of like the Apollo missions in the 60s and 70s at NASA, the US space program. And this particular one imagines that the Korean War went on longer and that most of the men who would have become astronauts were tied up in the war. So NASA turned to the Mercury 13 for its first astronauts in space. The Mercury 13 was a real group of women who took the same tests as male astronaut candidates, but they were ultimately banned from ever becoming astronauts themselves. In this timeline, they do become astronauts and they become the first Americans in space. So this novella has 2 storylines. The first one is one of the Mercury 13 women named Cobb, and just her perspective as they have their first missions into space. The second storyline follows a man who is called in to do a deep sea dive to retrieve like this capsule from a spy satellite that went off course and landed in the ocean like near the Bermuda Triangle. And there's only a very tenuous connection between these 2 storylines, which I feel like is the first reason this didn't work so well for me. It's very short. Each of these storylines is also short and to the point, and there's almost no connection between them. And it just left me hanging, asking, what was the point of that? I was kind of bored by the Mercury 13 storyline because I don't know, it wasn't written in a very compelling way. I didn't find Cobb that interesting, and it was so short. And then the deep sea dive storyline, I liked this a lot more. I kept wanting to get back to that one because it was just unusual. I haven't read that much science fiction that takes place underwater basically, and what the man finds at the bottom of the ocean near the Bermuda Triangle. It was really interesting. But I also felt like that storyline, it didn't really diverge from real history that much. Like, what was the point of this? The last part of the novella, I think in all of these, is basically an appendix, and in this one the appendix is Sales's essay on the real events and how he adapted them, and I just didn't think there was that much difference between reality and the alternate reality in this. So basically, the elements of this just never combined to become more than the sum of its parts, and I really just thought that the other three stories in this quartet were done better, were more compelling reads. So I read it, I finished the series, but this is not the one I'd recommend starting with. Next up, I read The Circus of Dr. Lao by Charles G. Finney. This was published in 1935, and it won one of the very first National Book Awards, which I found very interesting. This is about a strange little circus, the Circus of Dr. Lao, that comes to Abalone, Arizona, this kind of sleepy little town, very typical America, and it's about the residents of the town as they watch the circus come in and its parade, and then they go to see the creatures of the circus. The circus is full of actual, magical, mythical creatures. They have a unicorn, a Medusa, a mermaid, this thing called the Hound of the Hedges, which I found very interesting, and more things like that. But these very normal people, a little bit on the ignorant side, are so convinced that these creatures can't exist that they see them as fakes. They are seeing just miracles of magic, basically, and they think they are fake. And I think that's kind of the point of this story, actually, of you see what you expect to see, perhaps, even when you are confronted with real magic. It's a very odd, curious little story, and I liked it. The one thing that did reduce my enjoyment of it somewhat is that it definitely contains some racist terms and stereotypes of the era. And I wasn't quite sure what to think of Dr. Lao himself and the depiction of this Chinese man, because he varies wildly between being a very well-spoken man who gives these very fluent lectures on the animals in the circus, but when somebody asks him a question that he doesn't want to answer, or he doesn't want to deal with them, he like consciously reverts to this stereotype of a Chinese man who speaks only broken English and is very uncooperative and everything. And I'm not sure what to make of this depiction. The introduction makes it sound like Dr. Lao is just, he was written so differently from a lot of the Chinese characters in fiction of the time who were mainly depicted as villains. Lao is not a villain. And he's actually mostly shown as a very intelligent explorer and speaker, but there's still that use of a very racist stereotype of Chinese people as well. And I don't know. My favorite thing about this is actually the end. It's a very short novella, but then there's this section at the end that continues the story in an appendix. It's called the catalog, and it's a list of all of the people and animals and things in the story, and it tells you more about them, like their history or what ultimately happened to some of the people. It's definitely like the story is continued in a glossary rather than it being an actual glossary. And my favorite part of that is the very last section, which is titled The Questions, Contradictions, and Obscurities, which it's a list of questions that the story never answers, like, was it a bear or a Russian or what? If the circus didn't come to Abalone on the railroad and didn't come on trucks, how did it get there? It's a very self-aware book, and I really liked that, but I do have to say that some of the racist stuff in it was not cool. And the last thing that I finished this week was Mission of Gravity by Hal Clement. This is quite an old science fiction story, and I think that some people might think it's pretty dry and simple compared to modern science fiction, but I really enjoyed it for just what it was trying to be at the time, which is basically a quest storyline with characters solving all their problems with scientific know-how. And I really liked that. So this is about the planet Mescaline, which has very unusual gravity. At the poles, it has 700 times the gravity as Earth. Humans lose their space probe at one of the poles, and because of the gravity, they're unable to retrieve it. So the humans contact the sentient species on the planet, the mesclanites, and they ask the captain of like a sea trading vessel, Barlinen is his name, if he will take this journey from where he lives in one hemisphere down across the equator to the other pole to retrieve the space probe for them, because the mesclanites live in this very high gravity all the time. Barlinen says yes, and the whole story is from his perspective as the mesclanite crew makes this trek across like half of the globe, I swear, with some help from the humans to retrieve the space probe. And it's a really interesting look at how things are different when forces of gravity vary so wildly from not so much to insanely high, and just the effects that have on life. Like, for example, the mesclanites are terrified of things being above them, things falling, because they're so heavy, like you could die if you fall 6 inches or something. And they also have no concept of flying or throwing things. That was really interesting. I think I probably enjoyed this more than I thought I was going to, because it's from the perspective of the mesclanites, of the alien species. And I think in some ways they really come across as more human than alien species should, but they were still really interesting, and I enjoyed seeing it from their perspective. I think it shows you more what life is actually like on Mesclun than if you were seeing it from the humans' perspectives, because frankly, they can't do much during the story except watch and share satellite maps and stuff like that. I really enjoyed it. I found myself wanting to get back to it whenever I was interrupted in my reading. I wanted to know what the next problem would be and how they would solve it. It was good. I don't think it's amazing by today's science fiction standards, but it's still a good read. And that is it for me this week. Those are all the things that I read. It's a bit disappointing that most of these didn't rise above about a 3-star rating, but sometimes that happens. Let me know if you have read any of these, if you have any thoughts on them, maybe leave me a comment down below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back with another video at some point, and until then, bye.